Okay, stop. Before you scroll past this one because of the title, I need you to understand something. This is not a weird video. This is not a gross video. This is one of the most genuinely fascinating rabbit holes in all of ancient history, and the fact that almost nobody has made it is exactly the problem. Half of every human population that has ever lived has menstruated. For as long as our species has existed, we're talking hundreds of thousands of years. And yet, when historians sit down to write about the ancient Americas, you get 400 pages on pyramids, sun gods, and human sacrifice, and approximately 0 sentences on what an Inca teenager or a Navajo girl actually did the week her period started. Somehow, we know the exact battle formation the Aztecs used against Cortez, but nobody thought to ask what a woman packed for the week. That's a gap. Today we're closing it. We're covering the whole hemisphere, Mesoamerica, the Andes, North America, and the Arctic, and we're finding out what women actually used, how they kept it in place, what happened the first time it happened to them, and, because we're not going to pretend otherwise, which parts of this story we can actually prove versus which parts are educated guesswork. Some of the answers are clever, some are strange. One of them involves stuffing moss into a pad thousands of years before anyone put one in a cardboard box and sold it at a pharmacy. Let's go. Let's start in Mesoamerica, because between the Maya and the Aztec, it gives us the closest thing to a paper trail. Both cultures wired the moon directly into female biology. The most important Maya moon goddess, generally known as Ixchel, ran fertility, childbirth, weaving, and medicine as one job description, and colonial sources link her lunar cycle explicitly to the menstrual one. The Aztecs, meanwhile, had a goddess named Tlazolteotl, whose name roughly translates to eater of filth, and whose entire portfolio was ritual purification and the cleansing of bodily transgressions. A goddess literally named after eating dirt, in charge of making things clean. Mesoamerican theology was doing metaphor a lot more literally than most religions bother to. There's also a genuinely fun aside for the numbers people here. The Maya sacred calendar, the Tzolk'in, ran on a 260-day cycle, which happens to land suspiciously close to the average human gestation length counted from a missed period to birth. Some Mesoamericanist researchers have floated the idea that this isn't a coincidence, that a civilization famous for obsessively counting time was, among other things, counting female reproductive cycles at a population scale. Nobody can prove intent behind a 2,000-year-old calendar from the outside, so file that one under delightfully unproven rather than settled fact. Now, what did women actually have to work with? Cotton and maguey, the tough fiber stripped from agave leaves. And here's the class dimension, because every single civilization we're about to cover has one. Cotton was restricted to nobility by Aztec custom, while everyone else wore and used cloth made from maguey. Getting that fiber usable took real labor. The thick leaves were cut, scraped, pounded, and soaked until the coarse material gave way to something soft enough to spin, which is essentially the same process flax goes through on a completely different continent with a completely different plant. No surviving text says, "and here is what she folded and used." That specific detail is inference, not a quote. But a civilization producing this much soft, absorbent fiber for this many other soft, absorbent fiber jobs was not exactly short on raw material. There's also the temazcal, a small stone sweat bath used across Mesoamerica for regular bathing and postpartum recovery specifically. This wasn't symbolic. It was the household's actual plumbing, and it's a safe bet that the same water used to wash everything else in the house also washed and reused whatever cloth a woman was using that week. And since nobody ever asked this on camera, none of this material was single-use anywhere on the hemisphere, because single-use was a luxury nobody had yet. Cloth and hide got washed in whatever water was closest, dried by fire or sun depending on climate, and put back into rotation until they physically fell apart. At which point they didn't get thrown out, they got demoted into rags, padding, or tinder. Moss is the one genuine exception in this whole story, since it was easy enough to gather fresh that it functioned more like a disposable material than a laundry item. Every other region on this list was running what is functionally a reusable system, thousands of years before reusable became a marketing word on a package. Now the Andes, and here the record actually gets sharper instead of hazier, which almost never happens in this kind of research. Inca girls went through a ceremony called Quicochico, and it kicked in at the exact moment of the first period. Not a birthday, not a vague age range, the actual biological event. She left the household alone, went into seclusion, sometimes described as heading off into the countryside, and stayed there until the bleeding stopped completely. She fasted for a set number of days. When she came back, she was bathed, dressed in adult clothing woven specifically for the occasion, and given a brand new adult name in front of her entire family, replacing the name she'd had since childhood. That's not a vague cultural vibe reconstructed from pottery shards. That's a fully choreographed life event, recorded directly by colonial chroniclers, and it's arguably better organized than most modern coming-of-age parties, corn cake and thin cake designers included. Somebody in that household had to be weaving that new outfit in advance, which tells you this wasn't a scramble. It was anticipated and prepared for. On top of that, Mama Killa, Mother Moon, had her own temple in Cusco, staffed by priestesses, and Inca religion directly credited her with regulating women's cycles alongside her day job running the calendar. Two unrelated civilizations, separated by mountains and jungle with zero contact between them. And the moon ends up doing the exact same double duty in both, tracking time for the state and tracking the female body, as if those were obviously the same category of counting to begin with. For material, the Andes had some of the most technically sophisticated fiber production anywhere on the planet before industrialization. Fine alpaca and llama wool called kumbi for elites, coarser everyday cloth called ahuasca for everyone else. Same class split as Mesoamerica, just with wool instead of cotton. No chronicler ever wrote the specific line we'd want quoted here. But a society that graded its wool this precisely at this volume was clearly not scraping the bottom of the barrel for material. Let's head north, because this is where the story stops being empire-level bureaucracy and starts being living tradition. You can, in some cases, just go ask someone about directly. Start with the Navajo. The ceremony is Kinaalda, held after a girl's first period running several days. She runs toward the sunrise multiple times on consecutive mornings. Her female relatives physically mold her body with their hands, a literal, hands-on ritual act of shaping her into her adult form. She helps bake a massive corn cake overnight in a pit dug into the ground, shared with the whole community once it's done. Ordinary chores stop completely for the length of the ceremony. This is a multi-day, fully sanctioned, community-organized break from labor built around her. Now put the Apache ceremony right next to it, because the contrast is the whole point. It's called Na'i'is, the sunrise ceremony, also triggered directly by the first period, but the specific details are their own thing entirely. It runs 4 days. At one point, the girl is physically painted with a pollen mixture across her skin, and there's a wonderfully specific rule attached to it. During the ceremony, she isn't allowed to scratch her own skin with her fingernails. Tradition held it would cause sores or scarring, so she's handed a dedicated scratching stick instead. That is an extremely precise, physical, teachable instruction, passed hand to hand from older women to younger ones, and honestly, it's a more specific self-care rule than most of what gets recommended on the internet today. Beyond these two named ceremonies, seclusion structures, sometimes called moon lodges, sometimes just a separate space set aside for the purpose, show up across a huge range of nations on the continent. It would be lazy to flatten all of that into one identical practice, because the specific rules varied enormously, nation to nation. But one pattern holds up repeatedly. A menstruating woman was commonly relieved of her usual chores, other women covered food preparation without being asked, and the time itself doubled as instruction. Exactly the kind of practical, hand-me-down knowledge this whole video is chasing. And there's a genuinely interesting split in how a girl actually found out what was happening to her the first time, depending on where she lived. Up in the Arctic, the pattern skews proactive. A mother or older relative saw it coming and walked the girl through it directly and immediately. No drama, no mystery. In the ceremony-based systems, it worked the other way around. The event itself was the trigger, and the whole household or community organized around it after the fact rather than briefing her in advance. Neither approach treated it as something to hide out of embarrassment. It just moved through female relatives hand to hand, exactly the same way the technique for preparing moss or folding a hide moved. And here's where North America gives us something confirmed in actual peer-reviewed research instead of educated inference. Multiple indigenous groups, ethnobotanically documented, used sphagnum moss, a soft, wildly absorbent plant material pulled straight out of bogs, specifically as menstrual pads. Pull it up, pick out the twigs, dry it, use it. This is directly recorded among the Inuit people of what's now Nunavut, and it's the single most concrete, here's exactly what she used answer in this entire story. In drier regions without bogs, like much of the Southwest, soft-tanned buckskin did the same job, worked pliable and folded the same way cloth was folded elsewhere. Moss, where the environment provided moss, hide where it didn't. Which brings us to the Arctic, where the record gets even more specific. Multiple sources describe Inuit women using rabbit skin, fox fur, or moss as sanitary material, and separately, laying a rabbit skin directly on the sleeping platform at night specifically to catch blood while she slept, swapped out and cleaned the next morning. Drying anything up here meant working with almost no direct sun for months at a stretch, so wet fur got hung near the quollic, the seal oil lamp that heated the home, rather than left out in open air. And then there's Sedna, the goddess who lives at the bottom of the sea and personally controls every seal, walrus, and whale a hunting community depends on to survive the winter. The rules protecting that relationship specifically included behavior around menstruation, and breaking them was believed to anger her enough to withhold the animals entirely. Compare that for a second to Pliny the Elder, over in Rome, insisting menstrual blood could sour wine and kill bees just by a woman walking past a field. Pliny's version is superstition dressed up as science. Sedna's version is a coherent risk management system for a hunting economy where one bad season could genuinely kill everyone. Dressed up as a myth, sure, but built on real ecological stakes, not vibes. Quick fun fact before we wrap this up, because it puts everything you just heard into perspective. The modern disposable pad wasn't invented until 1888, a product called Lister's Towels, made by Johnson & Johnson, and it flopped hard because Victorian women were too embarrassed to buy one from a male pharmacist. Mass adoption didn't actually happen until 1921, when Kotex ran an advertising campaign that reframed the whole category as basic hygiene instead of an embarrassing personal item. Which means the modern pad is barely 100 years old, and everything we just covered — cotton, maguey, wool, moss, fur, ceremonies with names and choreography — was running the entire hemisphere for tens of thousands of years before that. So let's take a breath and figure out what this actually means. First, women across this entire hemisphere were never passive about their own biology. Every single region we covered developed a practical, regionally specific, generationally refined solution matched exactly to whatever the local environment provided. Nobody was improvising in a panic every month for thousands of years. This was solved repeatedly, independently, everywhere, by people who then taught the solution to their daughters with enough precision that some of it, the moss, the ceremonies, the scratching stick, is still being practiced or documented today. Second, material was never the bottleneck anywhere. Cotton, maguey, wool, moss, hide, fur — every region had exactly what it needed sitting nearby, and every region figured out how to process it, hold it in place, and wash or replace it on a schedule. What actually varied region to region was the ceremony and the social structure wrapped around the biology. Some cultures built in celebration and a hard stop on labor, others built in restriction, and a few, like the Inuit relationship with Sedna, built in something closer to serious risk management for an entire hunting economy. The plumbing was never the hard part. The meaning attached to it was, and that's the part that actually differed from valley to valley. Third, and this is the one that actually stings a little, most of what we know survives by accident, a colonial chronicler's passing aside, a ceremony that never stopped being practiced and is still alive today, a single ethnobotanical study that happened to ask the right question about moss, and on the other side of the ledger, an entire library of Maya knowledge that we will simply never get back, burned by a man who wrote down his own justification for doing it and apparently felt fine about that. One last thing, because we've talked about pads and hide and moss and said nothing about pain. Women weren't just trying to manage the blood, they were trying to manage the cramps too. And long before painkillers, that meant turning the plants around them into medicine. Across indigenous Mesoamerican traditions, leaves, stems, roots, and aromatic herbs were prepared specifically for menstrual pain. Leaves of Piper auritum, for example, could be crushed or torn up, dropped into hot water, left to steep, and then drunk as a warm tea for painful menstruation. Roots could be treated differently. Wild yam rhizomes were chopped or crushed, then boiled for longer to pull more of the plant into the water, producing a stronger decoction for cramps. It wasn't a quick cup of tea. A pot could sit over the fire while the roots simmered, the water slowly becoming darker and more concentrated before it was finally strained and drunk. In parts of Mexico, women also used Agastache mexicana, an aromatic herb traditionally associated with menstrual pain. Leaves and stems could be steeped into an infusion and drunk warm, and some treatments weren't just taken internally. Herbs could also be added to heated water for a warm, medicinal bath, combining the plants with something women everywhere still use for cramps today: heat. So picture the scene properly. A woman is sitting beside a small fire. Someone beside her crushes fresh leaves between their hands. A root gets sliced into pieces with a stone blade. Everything goes into a clay vessel with water. The pot starts steaming. The smell of the herbs fills the room. She drinks the bitter liquid slowly while more water heats nearby for a warm bath. And none of this knowledge appeared overnight. Someone had to try one plant and realize it did nothing. Someone else tried another and noticed the pain eased. The useful preparations were remembered, repeated, adjusted, and passed from mothers to daughters, healers to younger women, generation after generation. No tablets, no pharmacy, but definitely not do nothing and suffer. They had recipes, they had preparation methods, and they had thousands of years to figure out which ones were worth remembering. We've got entire museums built around ancient weapons. We reconstruct battle formations down to the last soldier's footing. We will happily watch a 3-hour documentary about a single Aztec emperor, but the practical, universal, monthly reality of half the population of every single one of these societies barely gets a footnote. It's not that the evidence doesn't exist. Some of it burned. Some of it is still being lived right now by women in communities that never stopped practicing it. And some of it was simply never considered worth writing down in the first place by the men holding the pens. For centuries, historians often treated things like this as too private, too awkward, or simply too ordinary to write down. But for women, there was nothing ordinary about dealing with bleeding, pain, and everything that came with it, month after month, for thousands upon thousands of years. They had no modern products and no pharmacy to fall back on. They used whatever their world gave them, experimented, adapted, and found practical solutions that made life a little easier. Most of those women never had their names recorded, but their ingenuity was real. And that's why I thought this story deserved its own video. As a small tribute to the women who dealt with something history barely bothered to mention and still found ways to make it work. What surprised you most about how ancient women managed their periods? And is there anything you think we still haven't figured out about their everyday lives? Let me know in the comments.